Dr. Paul Holmes stepped off the interstellar transport, his heart racing with anticipation. The alien before him was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a humanoid figure composed of vibrant green leaves and delicate petals. This was Horus, his Lurian liaison, and she was about to ask him for something that would change both their species forever. The air on the Lurian homeworld was thick with the scent of exotic flora. Paul's eyes darted around, taking in the alien landscape. Massive biodomes dotted the horizon, each a self-contained ecosystem teeming with plant life. But beneath the surface beauty, a sinister threat lurked. "Welcome, Dr. Holmes," Horus said, her voice a melodic rustle. "We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." Paul nodded, his mind already racing with scientific possibilities. "I'm honored to be here. The situation sounds dire." Horus's leaves drooped slightly. "It is. The blight threatens our very existence. We hope your expertise in xenobiology can save us." As they walked towards the research facility, Horus explained the crisis in detail. A devastating plague was sweeping through the Lurian population, rendering them infertile. Their carefully cultivated method of reproduction, combining genetic material in nutrient-rich pods to grow offspring, was failing. Without intervention, their civilization would collapse within generations. The research facility was a marvel of biotechnology. Transparent tubes filled with glowing liquids snaked through the building. In them, Paul could see the remnants of failed Lurian seedlings, withered and malformed. "This is our reproduction chamber," Horus said, gesturing to a large pulsating pod. "Normally, 2 Lurians would contribute genetic material here to create new life. But now—" She trailed off, her flower-like face creasing with worry. Paul approached the pod, his scientific curiosity piqued. He began analyzing the Lurian reproductive process, comparing it to what he knew of human biology. To his astonishment, he discovered a remarkable similarity between Lurian and human DNA. Convergent evolution had led both species down surprisingly parallel paths. This compatibility sparked an idea in Paul's mind, one that could potentially save the Lurians. "What if," he began, excitement building in his voice, "we introduced human genetic material to counteract the blight's effects?" Horus's eyes widened, her leaves quivering. "Interspecies breeding. It's unprecedented. There would be cultural concerns, ethical debates." Paul nodded, understanding the weight of his suggestion. "Of course, it's just a hypothesis at this stage. We'd need to run extensive tests, consult with your leaders." As Paul immersed himself in his work, he remained oblivious to the growing attraction Horus felt towards him. She watched him tirelessly analyze data, formulate theories, and push the boundaries of science. In him, she saw not just the potential savior of her people, but a kindred spirit. The Lurian High Council convened to discuss Paul's proposal. The debate was heated, with some members embracing the radical solution and others recoiling at the idea of mixing their sacred genetic lineage with an alien species. Meanwhile, Horus made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. As Paul announced a breakthrough in his research, she approached him with determination in her eyes. "Dr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have a request, one that may shock you, but I believe it's necessary for the survival of my people." Paul looked up from his work, curious. "What is it, Horus?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I want you to breed with me, to combine our genetic material and create a hybrid offspring resistant to the blight." Paul's jaw dropped, his mind reeling from the implications of her request. The scientific potential was enormous, but so were the ethical concerns and personal complications. As he stood there, staring at the alien plant woman who had just propositioned him, Paul realized he was on the precipice of a decision that could change the fate of an entire species, and his own life, forever. Paul stared at Horus, his mind struggling to process her unexpected request. The implications of interspecies breeding were staggering, both scientifically and ethically. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "I understand this is a lot to take in," Horus said, her leaves rustling softly. "Take some time to consider it. We don't have to decide anything right now." Paul nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "Thank you, Horus. I need to think about this. Over the next few days, Paul immersed himself in research, poring over genetic data and running countless simulations. The more he studied, the more convinced he became of the potential in Horace's proposal. Still, the ethical concerns nagged at him. On the fourth day, Paul made his decision. He found Horace in the research facility's arboretum, tending to a patch of bioluminescent flowers. "I've been thinking about your request," Paul began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And I believe we need to present this idea to the Lurian High Council. If we're going to pursue this, we need full transparency and support." Horace's petals quivered with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. "You're right, of course. I'll arrange an emergency session immediately." The council chamber was a massive geodesic dome, its walls alive with pulsating vines and vibrant flowers. Paul stood before the assembled Lurian leaders, their plant-like forms a sea of green and gold. He took a deep breath and began his presentation. "Esteemed council members, I stand before you with a potential solution to the blight threatening your species," Paul said, his voice echoing in the chamber. He outlined his theory, explaining the remarkable genetic compatibility between humans and Lurians. As he spoke, holographic displays flickered to life, showing complex DNA strands and simulated hybrid embryos. "By introducing human genetic material, we may be able to create offspring resistant to the blight," Paul concluded. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of rustling leaves and vibrating stems as the council members debated among themselves. Elder Czar, the head of the council, raised a gnarled branch for silence. "This is a radical proposal, Dr. Holmes," Czar said, his voice like creaking wood. "The implications are significant." Before Paul could respond, another Lurian stepped forward. His form was more angular than the others, with sharp-edged leaves and thorny protrusions. "Esteemed colleagues, I must object," the Lurian said. "I am Thorne, chief geneticist of the Central Science Academy. Dr. Holmes's theory is untested and potentially dangerous." Thorne's eyes narrowed as he looked at Paul. "Introducing human DNA could have catastrophic effects on our physiology. I propose an alternative, targeted genetic manipulation of our existing seedlings." The council chamber once again filled with the sound of debate. Paul watched as the Lurian leaders split into factions, some supporting his plan, others backing Thorne's approach. Suddenly, Horace stepped forward, her form glowing with bioluminescence. "Honored Council, I volunteer to be the first test subject for Dr. Holmes's experiment." A hush fell over the chamber. Horace continued, her voice strong and clear. "Our species faces extinction. We must take bold action if we hope to survive. I believe Dr. Holmes's plan offers our best chance." Elder Czar nodded slowly, his ancient form creaking as he moved. "Your courage is admirable, Horace. Council, we must vote on this matter." The next few minutes were tense as the council members cast their votes. Paul's heart raced as he watched the holographic tally. Finally, Elder Czar announced the result. "By a narrow margin, the council approves Dr. Holmes's experiment," Czar said. "However, we impose strict conditions. Extensive testing and safety protocols must be implemented before any attempt at creating a hybrid offspring." Paul felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over him. Czar continued, "A team of our scientists will work alongside Dr. Holmes, including Thorne, to ensure proper oversight." As the council session adjourned, Paul and Horace made their way to the lab. The real work was about to begin. Over the next weeks, Paul and Horace spent long hours together in the lab. As they worked, they shared stories of their respective worlds. Paul described Earth's oceans and mountains, while Horace told tales of ancient Lurian myths. One evening, as they were analyzing genetic sequences, Horace asked, "Paul, what was your childhood like? Did you always want to be a scientist?" Paul smiled, remembering. "I grew up in a small town near the ocean. I was always curious about the world around me, always asking questions. My parents gave me a microscope for my 10th birthday, and that was it. I was hooked on science." Horace's leaves rustled in what Paul had come to recognize as laughter. "It seems some things are universal. I, too, was endlessly curious as a seedling." As they talked, Paul found himself drawn to Horace in a way he hadn't expected. Her intelligence, her courage, her otherworldly beauty, it all captivated him. Their progress, however, was not without setbacks. Equipment malfunctions, contaminated samples, inexplicable errors in their data, obstacles seemed to appear at every turn. Paul grew increasingly suspicious as the problems mounted. One night, unable to sleep, Paul returned to the lab to review their latest test results. As he entered, he saw a figure hunched over one of the workstations. It was Thorn, inputting data into the system. "What are you doing here?" Paul demanded. Thorn spun around, his thorny form overflowing. "Dr. Holmes, I was just double-checking some figures." Paul's eyes narrowed. "At this hour, without authorization?" Thorn's leaves rustled agitatedly. "I don't need authorization. This is my lab, too." Paul stepped closer, his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. "You've been sabotaging our work, haven't you? Tampering with equipment, altering results?" Thorn's form seemed to grow larger, his thorns extending. "You have no proof. And even if you did, who would believe you? An alien over one of their own?" Paul's fists clenched at his sides. "I won't let you endanger the future of an entire species because of your ego." Thorn lunged forward, his thorny appendages swinging at Paul. Paul ducked, feeling the rush of air as Thorn's arm passed over his head. He tackled the Lurian scientist, and they crashed into a nearby workstation. The sound of shattering glass and crunching metal filled the lab as they grappled. Alarms began to blare, and the room filled with a fine mist, the remnants of their latest experiment, now destroyed in the chaos. Security personnel burst into the lab, pulling Paul and Thorn apart. Horace appeared moments later, her eyes wide with shock as she surveyed the damage. "Paul, what happened?" she exclaimed, rushing to his side. As Paul opened his mouth to explain, he realized the full implications of what had just occurred. The destroyed experiment could set them back weeks, time the Lurians might not have. And now he faced the daunting task of proving Thorn's sabotage to the Council. Meeting Horace's worried gaze, Paul saw his own feelings reflected in her plant-like eyes. They had grown close over the past weeks, their relationship evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. Now, with this new complication, Paul wondered how they would navigate the complex web of scientific challenges, political pressures, and their own deepening emotions. As the security team led Thorn away, Paul took Horace's leaf-like hand in his own. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Together. The lab fell silent save for the distant wail of alarms and the rustle of Horace's leaves. As security personnel escorted Thorn away, Elder Czar arrived, his ancient form creaking with each step. His eyes, like polished amber, surveyed the destruction. "Explain," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. Paul recounted the events, his words tumbling out in a rush. Horace corroborated his story, her leaves trembling with awe-inspiring anger. Elder Czar listened, his expression unreadable. "This is a grave matter," he said finally. "I am assigning additional security to the lab. We will investigate Thorn's actions thoroughly." Over the next few days, Paul and Horace worked tirelessly to salvage what they could from the ruined experiment. The loss was devastating, forcing them to start over on critical aspects of their research. "We've lost weeks of work," Paul muttered, rubbing his eyes as he stared at the lab's holographic displays. The data scrolling before him seemed to mock their setback. Horace placed a leaf-like hand on his shoulder. "We'll recover, Paul. We have to." As they redoubled their efforts, tension grew within the research team. Whispers of Thorn's accusations spread, and Paul found himself under increasing scrutiny from some of the Lurian scientists. One afternoon, as Paul calibrated a gene sequencer, he overheard two Lurian researchers talking in hushed tones. "Can we trust the humans' methods?" one asked, their stems swaying with agitation. "Elder Czar seems to think so," the other replied. "But Thorn had a point. We're risking everything on an untested theory." Paul's lips pursed, but he forced himself to focus on his work. He knew results were the only thing that would silence the doubters. As days stretched into weeks, Paul and Horace fell into a grueling routine. They worked long into the night, breaking only when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. During these rare moments of respite, they found solace in each other's company. One evening, as they shared a meal of nutrient-rich Lurian fruit, Horace asked, "Tell me about your home, Paul. What's it like to live on a world with so much water?" Paul smiled, his eyes distant. "It's beautiful. The oceans stretch as far as the eye can see, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. It's like a lullaby." Horace's leaves rustled with curiosity. "We have nothing like that here. Our seas are shallow, more like vast swamps." As Paul described Earth's diverse ecosystems, Horace listened intently, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with excitement. In turn, she shared stories of Lurian history, of great migrations guided by the stars and ancient conflicts with now extinct predators. Their growing intimacy didn't go unnoticed. Other researchers exchanged knowing looks as Paul and Horace worked side by side, their movements in perfect sync. One night, as they analyzed genetic sequencing data, their hands brushed against each other. Paul felt a jolt of electricity at the contact, and Horace's leaves quivered. They leaned closer, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Just as their faces were inches apart, a shrill alarm blared through the lab. They jumped apart, startled. "Alert! Anomaly detected in Experiment 37B, the lab's AI announced. Paul and Horace rushed to the incubation chamber, their hearts racing. Inside, a tiny seedling glowed with an otherworldly light. Its DNA readout flashed on a nearby screen, showing a perfect blend of human and Lurian genetic markers. "It's viable," Paul whispered, his voice filled with awe. "And look at these readings. It's showing resistance to the blight." Horace's leaves trembled with excitement. "We did it, Paul. We actually did it." The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, Elder Czar called an emergency council meeting. Paul and Horace stood before the assembled Lurian leaders, presenting their findings with almost unchecked excitement. "As you can see," Paul said, gesturing to the holographic display of the hybrid seedling's genetic structure, "the human DNA has integrated seamlessly with the Lurian genome, creating a new strain that's resistant to the blight." Questions flew from all corners of the chamber. Some council members expressed cautious optimism, while others voiced concerns about the long-term implications of introducing human DNA into the Lurian gene pool. As the debate raged, a messenger burst into the chamber. "Urgent news from the outer colonies," he announced, his leaves wilting with distress. "A new strain of the blight has appeared. It's spreading faster than anything we've seen before." The chamber erupted in chaos. Elder Czar raised his gnarled branches for silence. "Dr. Holmes, Horace," he said, his voice grave, "in light of this development, the Council grants you permission to proceed with full-scale testing of your hybrid solution. But be warned, we will be watching closely. The fate of our species rests in your hands." Paul and Horace exchanged determined looks. They knew the real work was just beginning. As they left the council chamber, Paul's communicator beeped. He activated it, revealing a stern-faced human official. "Dr. Holmes," the official said, her voice clipped. "This is Admiral Chen of the United Nations Interstellar Affairs Committee. We've received reports of your experiments. You are hereby ordered to cease all activities immediately and return to Earth for debriefing. The ethical implications of your work are deeply concerning." Paul stared at the communicator, his pupils dilating. He looked at Horace, then back at the human official. The weight of his next decision pressed down on him, heavier than any gravity he'd ever experienced. "Admiral," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind, "I understand your concerns, but the situation here is—" "This is not a negotiation, Dr. Holmes," Admiral Chen interrupted. "You have 48 hours to comply, or you will be declared a fugitive from Earth." The communication cut off, leaving Paul and Horace standing in stunned silence. The corridor around them buzzed with activity as Lurian scientists hurried to their tasks, unaware of the new complication that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. Horace placed a gentle leaf on Paul's arm. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Paul looked into her plant-like eyes, seeing the same mixture of fear and perseverance that he felt. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat as he realized the full magnitude of the choice before him. Paul's mind raced as he considered the weight of Admiral Chen's ultimatum. He glanced at Horus, her leaf-like form radiating concern and support. With a deep breath, he made his decision. "I can't abandon this project, Horus. The stakes are too high." Horus's leaves rustled in agreement. "What will you tell them?" Paul activated his communicator and began composing a message to the United Nations Interstellar Affairs Committee. His fingers flew over the holographic keyboard as he carefully crafted his response. "Admiral Chen, I understand your concerns regarding the ethical implications of our work. However, I must stress the critical nature of our research. The Lurian species faces extinction from a rapidly evolving blight. Our experiments offer the only viable solution we've found. I respectfully request additional time to complete our work. The potential benefits for both humanity and the Lurians are immeasurable. I assure you, we are proceeding with the utmost care and consideration for all ethical concerns." He paused, reviewing his words before sending the message. "It's done," he said to Horus. "Now we wait." While they awaited a response from Earth, Horus approached Elder Czar with a bold proposal. Paul watched from a distance as Horus's leaves trembled with intensity, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing rapidly as she spoke to the ancient Lurian. Elder Czar's gnarled form seemed to sag under the weight of Horus's words. When she returned to Paul's side, her eyes gleamed with a mix of purpose and apprehension. "What did you tell him?" Paul asked. "I volunteered to undergo the hybridization process myself," Horus replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "To carry a hybrid offspring to term." Paul's eyes widened in shock. "Horus, that's incredibly risky. We don't know how your body will react to—" "We don't have time for further simulations," Horus interrupted. "The new strain of blight is spreading faster than we anticipated. We need results, Paul. Real, tangible results." The news of Horus's decision spread quickly through the research facility. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some Lurian scientists praised her bravery, while others recoiled at the idea of mixing their species' DNA. Security around the facility tightened as Vex and his followers intensified their protests. Paul caught glimpses of the growing crowd outside the perimeter fences, their signs and chants demanding an end to the abomination of their research. Inside the lab, Paul and Horus worked tirelessly to prepare for the hybridization procedure. They ran countless simulations, fine-tuning every aspect of the process. Paul's hands shook slightly as he calibrated the delicate equipment, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Horus for the 100th time. She placed a leaf-like appendage on his arm. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The day of the procedure arrived. The air in the lab crackled with tension as Paul and Horus made their final preparations. Elder Czar stood nearby, his amber eyes watching their every move. As Paul began the initial steps of the hybridization process, a piercing alarm cut through the air. The lab's AI announced, "Security breach detected. Multiple intruders attempting to access the facility." Elder Czar's leaves rustled with anger. "Vex," he growled, "I'll handle this. Continue your work." As the sounds of conflict echoed through the facility, Paul focused on the intricate procedure before him. Horus lay motionless, connected to a complex array of machinery. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed erratically, reflecting the strain on her system. Paul's concentration was shattered by the sound of shattering glass. He spun around to see Thorn, his thorny form silhouetted in the broken window. "I won't let you destroy our species," Thorn snarled, lunging toward the control panel. Paul intercepted him, grappling with the Lurian scientist. They crashed into a nearby workstation, sending equipment clattering to the floor. Paul felt Thorn's thorns dig into his skin as they struggled. "You don't understand," Paul gasped. "We're trying to save your people." Thorn's only response was a guttural growl as he reached for a fallen piece of equipment. Paul kicked it away, but in doing so, he lost his grip on Thorn. The Lurian scientist scrambled toward the main control panel, his thorny appendages extending toward the delicate machinery. Paul launched himself forward, tackling Thorn just as his thorns made contact with the panel. Sparks flew, and alarms blared as vital monitoring systems went dark. With a final surge of strength, Paul managed to subdue Thorn, pinning him to the ground. Security personnel burst into the lab, quickly taking charge of the situation. Paul rushed back to the control panel, his heart pounding. The hybridization process was at a critical stage, and the damaged equipment left him flying blind. He stared at the remaining functional displays, his mind racing as he tried to compensate for the lost data. "Horace," he called out, "I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling. Any sensation, no matter how small." Her voice came weak and strained. "Pressure, intense heat. Something is changing, Paul. It's happening so fast." Paul's fingers flew over the controls, making split-second adjustments based on Horace's feedback and his own instincts. He pushed aside the fear and doubt, focusing entirely on the task at hand. Outside the lab, the sounds of conflict grew louder. Paul caught glimpses of Elder Czar coordinating the defense, his ancient form moving with surprising agility as he directed security forces. Inside, Paul completed the final stages of the procedure, his breath held as he waited for the results. The remaining monitors flickered to life, displaying the first readings of the hybrid embryo. "It's viable," Paul breathed, a mixture of relief and awe washing over him. "And look at these markers. It's already showing resistance to the blight." His elation was short-lived as Horace let out a cry of pain. Paul turned to see her form convulsing, her leaves wilting and changing color rapidly. "Horace!" He rushed to her side, scanning the erratic readings on the medical monitors. The hybrid embryo was growing at an alarming rate, putting immense strain on Horace's system. Paul's mind raced as he tried to stabilize her. He needed to slow the embryo's growth without harming it, a challenge that pushed the limits of his knowledge in both human and Lurian biology. As he worked frantically to save Horace in their groundbreaking experiment, the battle outside reached a fever pitch. The lab's reinforced door shuddered under the impact of what sounded like battering rams. Elder Czar's voice came through the intercom, strained and urgent. "Dr. Holmes, we can't hold them back much longer. Whatever you're going to do it now." Paul looked from Horace's pain-racked form to the door, then back to the monitors showing the rapidly developing hybrid embryo. The fate of individuals, species, and interstellar relations all hinged on his next actions. With a deep breath, Paul began to prepare for a risky procedure, one that could save Horace and the embryo, or doom them both. As he gathered the necessary equipment, the sounds of the conflict outside grew ever closer, a constant reminder of the precious little time he had left. Paul's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared for the risky procedure. The sounds of battle grew louder, punctuated by the ominous creaking of the reinforced door. He glanced at Horace, her form writhing in pain, then back to the monitors displaying the hybrid embryo's rapid growth. Just as he was about to begin, a deafening crash reverberated through the lab. The door burst open, revealing Vex and his supporters, their faces contorted with rage. Paul's mind raced. There was no time for the procedure. In a split-second decision, he grabbed a syringe filled with a stabilizing compound and plunged it into Horace's system. His fingers flew over the nearby console, activating the emergency stasis field. A shimmering blue barrier enveloped Horace, creating an impenetrable cocoon around her and the precious embryo. Vex let out a roar of frustration as he charged forward, only to be repelled by the stasis field. Elder Czar burst into the lab, flanked by a group of loyal guards. "Protect Dr. Holmes and Horace," he commanded, his gnarled form moving with surprising agility as he engaged Vex. The lab erupted into chaos. Equipment crashed to the floor as Lurians grappled with each other. Paul ducked behind the stasis field, using it as a shield while frantically trying to maintain its stability. A stray energy blast from one of the guards' weapons struck the main power conduit. Sparks showered the room as alarms blared, signaling a cascading system failure. The lights flickered, plunging the lab into intermittent darkness. Paul's eyes widened as he realized the implications. "The stasis field won't hold without consistent power," he muttered, his mind already formulating a plan. With a grunt of effort, he began to detach the stasis pod from the lab equipment. "Elder Czar," he called out, "we need to move Horace. Cover us." The ancient Lurian nodded, his amber eyes gleaming with tenacity. He and his guards formed a protective circle around Paul as he maneuvered the pod towards the emergency exit. They pushed into the corridor, immediately encountering pockets of resistance. Paul, never trained for combat, found himself ducking and weaving as he guided the pod. He grabbed a broken piece of equipment, using it to deflect attacks from Vex's supporters. The facility had become a war zone. Alarms blared, mixing with the sounds of conflict echoing through the corridors. Paul's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed the pod forward, driven by an overwhelming need to protect Horus and their groundbreaking work. As they neared the emergency exit, Paul's heart sank. The facility's lockdown protocols had sealed all exits. He rushed to the control panel, his fingers flying over the interface as he attempted to override the system. Come on, he muttered, acutely aware of the dwindling power supply for Horus's stasis pod. The pursuing attackers were getting closer, their shouts growing louder. Paul's scientific knowledge came to the forefront as he improvised a bypass. He rerouted power from non-critical systems, praying it would be enough to open the door and maintain the stasis field. Just as the exit began to open, a familiar voice rang out. "Stop right there." Paul turned to see Vex, his thorny form silhouetted at the end of the corridor. The Lurian scientist's eyes burned with fanatical intensity as he raised a makeshift weapon. Before Vex could fire, another figure tackled him from the side. Paul's eyes widened in surprise as he recognized Thorn, grappling with his former ally. "Go!" Thorn shouted, his voice strained as he held Vex back. "Save her!" Paul hesitated for a split second, then pushed the pod through the opening. He caught a final glimpse of Thorn being overwhelmed by Vex's supporters before the door sealed behind them. The alien landscape of the Lurian world stretched before them, wild and unfamiliar. Paul's legs burned as he helped guide the pod over the uneven terrain, joined by Elder Zar and a small group of loyal Lurians. "We need to find cover," Elder Zar said, his leaves rustling in the alien wind. "I know of a secret outpost where we might find help." Paul nodded, his eyes constantly darting to the pod's power readout. He scavenged materials as they moved, using broken components from the pod's external systems to jury-rig a portable power source. The group pushed on through the harsh Lurian wilderness. Strange, bioluminescent plants cast an eerie glow over the landscape. In the distance, Paul could hear the calls of alien creatures, sending shivers down his spine. As they traveled, Paul found himself talking to Horus's unconscious form within the pod. "We're going to make it," he said softly, his hand resting on the stasis field. "I promise you, Horus, we've come too far to fail now." The sound of pursuit kept them moving at a grueling pace. Vex and his followers had managed to break out of the facility, their shouts carried on the wind. Paul's muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on, driven by a drive he never knew he possessed. Elder Zar led them through treacherous terrain, using his ancient knowledge to avoid the worst of the planet's dangers. Even so, they narrowly escaped encounters with carnivorous plants and strange, gelatinous creatures that oozed from the shadows. As they crested a hill, Paul's communicator crackled to life. The voice of Admiral Chen cut through the static. "Dr. Holmes, this is the United Nations Peacekeeping Force. We've entered Lurian airspace and are tracking your position. Hold tight." Paul's heart raced at this news. Help was coming, but would it arrive in time? And how would the Lurian High Council react to Earth's intervention? In the valley below, Paul could see the outline of a structure, the secret Lurian outpost. It represented their best hope for saving Horus and continuing their work. But as they began their descent, the sounds of Vex's approaching forces grew louder. Paul exchanged a look with Elder Zar. They stood at the precipice of potential safety, but the path ahead was far from clear. The stasis pod's power supply was nearly depleted, Vex's forces were closing in, and the implications of Earth's peacekeeping mission loomed large. As the first rays of the Lurian sun peeked over the horizon, Paul took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first rays of the Lurian sun peeked over the horizon, Paul took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The secret outpost loomed in the valley below, a beacon of hope amidst the alien landscape. However, as they descended, an unexpected obstacle came into view. A vast field of sickly, twisted flora stretched before them, surrounding the facility like a moat of decay. The plants pulsed with an unnatural, sickly glow. unmistakable signs of blight infection. Paul's heart sank as he realized the implications. "We can't go through there," he said, gesturing to the infected area. "The blight could compromise Horus's stasis pod and infect us all." Elder Zar's leaves rustled with concern. "Is there no way around?" Paul shook his head, his mind racing. He glanced at the stasis pod, then at the surrounding Lurian plant life. An idea began to form. "We can create a temporary shield," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Using a combination of Lurian plant secretions and our equipment, it might just be enough to get us through." As Paul explained his plan, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Vex and his followers crested the hill behind them, their thorny forms silhouetted against the alien sky. Both groups froze, acutely aware of the dangerous terrain separating them from their goal. Paul stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Vex, listen to me. We're all in danger here. The only way we're getting through that blighted field is by working together." Vex's eyes narrowed, his thorns filled with suspicion. But as he surveyed the infected landscape, the fight seemed to drain out of him. "What do you propose, human?" "A truce," Paul said. "Combine our knowledge, our resources. It's our only chance." After a tense moment, Vex nodded grudgingly. The two groups merged, an uneasy alliance born of necessity. Paul directed the Lurians on how to safely extract the necessary plant secretions, his xenobiological knowledge proving invaluable. He worked alongside Dr. Thorne, their earlier conflict set aside in the face of their shared peril. As they prepared to enter the blighted zone, Paul made final adjustments to their makeshift protective gear. The improvised shields flickered to life, surrounding each of them in a faint shimmering field. "Stay close," Paul warned, "and whatever you do, don't let the field drop." They entered the blighted area, the infected plants seeming to reach for them with twisted appendages. The air grew thick and acrid, making breathing difficult even through their protective gear. Paul kept a constant eye on Horus's stasis pod, making adjustments as the power supply fluctuated dangerously. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked, the oppressive heat of the blighted zone taking its toll. A loud screech pierced the air. From the twisted undergrowth emerged a creature that barely resembled its original Lurian form. Its body was bloated and misshapen, covered in pulsing growths. It lunged at the group, its movements unnaturally fast. "Scatter!" Elder Zar shouted. The group broke formation, narrowly avoiding the creature's attack. Paul found himself separated from the others, the stasis pod a dead weight in his arms. He stumbled backward, his mind racing for a solution. As the mutated beast turned towards him, Paul's scientific instincts kicked in. He noticed a pattern in the creature's movements, a sensitivity to certain frequencies in their protective fields. "Everyone," he shouted, "adjust your shields to frequency Delta 7. The others complied, their fields shifting to emit a high-pitched whine. The creature recoiled, its misshapen form writhing in discomfort. Taking advantage of its distraction, Vex and several other Lurians launched a coordinated attack, driving the beast back into the blighted underbrush. As the adrenaline of the encounter faded, Paul noticed several of Vex's followers looking at him with newfound respect. The dynamics of the group were shifting, the lines between ally and enemy blurring in the face of shared danger. They pressed on, encountering more mutated wildlife as they neared the outpost. Each time, Paul's quick thinking and scientific knowledge proved crucial to their survival. Even Vex, grudgingly, began to defer to Paul's judgment in critical moments. Just as the group's stamina was nearing its limit, a new sound cut through the toxic air. The distinctive hum of Earth spacecraft. Paul looked up to see sleek silver shapes cutting through the alien sky. Elder Zar produced a long-range communicator, his gnarled fingers working the controls with practiced ease. "This is Elder Zar of the Lurian High Council. We are in need of immediate assistance." A crisp female voice responded. "This is Captain Sarah Harris of the UN Peacekeeping Force. We have orders to extract Dr. Holmes and cease all human involvement in Lurian affairs." Paul's heart sank, but before he could protest, Elder Zar spoke again. "Captain, I implore you to reconsider. We are on the verge of a breakthrough that could save our entire species. We need Dr. Holmes." There was a long pause. Then, "Understood, Elder Czar. We're sending a specialized team to assist. Hold your position." Relief washed over Paul as he saw a smaller craft descend towards their location. It hovered just above the blighted zone, its advanced systems creating a clear path through the infected flora. From the craft emerged a team in advanced protective gear, led by a woman Paul recognized from briefings back on Earth. Dr. Emily Sato, one of the leading experts in xenobiology. "Dr. Holmes," she called out as she approached, "looks like you could use a hand." With the added support of the Earth team and their advanced equipment, the group finally reached the hidden outpost. As the facility's doors sealed behind them, Paul allowed himself a moment of relief, but he knew their challenges were nowhere near the end. The outpost's interior was a marvel of preserved Lurian technology, untouched by the blight that ravaged the world outside. Paul and Dr. Sato immediately set to work, their fingers flying over the alien controls as they prepared to revive Horus and stabilize the hybrid embryo. As Paul worked, he was acutely aware of Vex watching him intently. The Lurian scientist's expression was unreadable, but there was a new quality to his gaze, something almost like curiosity. Hours passed in a blur of intense concentration and delicate adjustments. The unique challenges presented by Horus's physiology and the hybrid embryo pushed Paul and Dr. Sato to the limits of their knowledge and creativity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Horus's eyes fluttered open. Paul felt a surge of emotion as he saw recognition in her gaze. "Paul," she said weakly, "you did it." He took her hand, ignoring the murmurs from the Lurians at this display of interspecies affection. "We did it," he corrected her. "And the embryo, it's showing strong signs of blight resistance." A cheer went up from the assembled humans and Lurians alike. Even Vex seemed moved, his earlier hostility fading in the face of this momentous achievement. But their celebration was short-lived. Alarms blared throughout the facility, cutting through the moment of triumph. Paul rushed to a nearby console, his eyes widening as he saw the readings. "The blight," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's evolving, adapting. It's breached the outpost's outer defenses." As if in response to his words, the facility shuddered. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the infected flora advancing, its tendrils probing for weaknesses in the outpost structure. Paul turned to the assembled group, humans and Lurians alike. Their earlier conflicts seemed trivial in the face of this new threat. "We need to synthesize a cure from the hybrid embryo," he said. "It's our only chance, but we'll have to work fast." He looked at Horus, then at Vex, then at the Earth team. The fate of an entire species hung in the balance. As the facility shuddered again under the blight's assault, Paul took a deep breath and prepared to face the greatest challenge of his career, and perhaps of two civilizations. The facility shuddered again, the blight's relentless assault threatening to breach the outpost's defenses. Paul's eyes darted between the nervous faces surrounding him, a mix of humans and Lurians united by their shared peril. "We need to move," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The outer labs are compromised. Everyone, gather what you can and head to the inner sanctum." As the group scrambled to collect vital equipment and data, Paul gently helped Horus to her feet. Her legs trembled, still weak from the long stasis, but perseverance blazed in her eyes. "I can walk," she insisted, though she leaned heavily on Paul's arm. They made their way through the twisting corridors of the outpost, the sounds of creaking metal and shattering glass echoing behind them. Dr. Sato led the way, her protective suit glinting under the emergency lights. Upon reaching the inner laboratories, Paul immediately set to work. His fingers flew across the alien controls, reconfiguring equipment for their desperate task. "Dr. Sato," he called out, "I need you to help me analyze the embryo's genetic structure. We're looking for any anomalies that might indicate blight resistance." As they worked, Horus and Elder Czar coordinated the remaining Lurians, setting up makeshift barricades and sealing off potential entry points. The normally serene Elder moved with unexpected agility, his ancient knowledge of the facility proving invaluable. Vex, his earlier hostility now a distant memory, approached Paul with an urgent gleam in his eye. "Human," he said, his thorns quivering with nervous energy. "I believe I can reinforce the airlock systems. It may buy us more time." Paul nodded, grateful for the Lurian scientists' initiative. "Take whoever you need, and Vex, thank you." As Vex departed with a team of mixed human and Lurian engineers, Captain Harris's voice crackled over the comms. "Dr. Holmes, we've established a defensive perimeter around the outpost. Our weapons are slowing the Blight's advance, but I don't know how long we can hold out." "Understood, Captain," Paul replied, his eyes never leaving the data streaming across his screen. "We're working as fast as we can." Hours blended together in a haze of frantic work and mounting tension. Paul's muscles ached, his eyes burned, but he pushed through the exhaustion. Beside him, Dr. Sato worked with equal intensity, her expertise in xenobiology proving invaluable. Suddenly, Paul's screen lit up with a promising pattern. "Emily, look at this," he said, gesturing to Dr. Sato. "The embryo is producing an enzyme I've never seen before. It's neutralizing the Blight's effects on a cellular level." Dr. Sato leaned in, her eyes widening behind her protective visor. "Incredible. If we could synthesize this, we could create a cure," Paul finished, a glimmer of hope igniting in his chest. But that hope was quickly tempered by harsh reality. Paul's brow furrowed as he ran the calculations. To produce enough of the enzyme, we'd need to accelerate the embryo's growth far beyond normal parameters. The strain on Horace's body... He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Sato placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her expression grim behind her faceplate. Paul called the team together, explaining his findings and the risks involved. As he spoke, he watched Horace's face, seeing the conflict play out in her alien features. Before he could finish, Horace stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said, her voice unwavering. "My life for our people, for our child, for both our worlds. It's not a difficult choice." Elder Czar immediately objected, his leaves rustling agitatedly. "Horace, you are a symbol to our people. The risk is too great." To everyone's surprise, it was Vex who spoke up in support of Horace. "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few," he said, his usual bravado replaced by solemn commitment. "If this is our only chance to save our world, we must take it." As the debate raged on, the facility rocked with a massive impact. Toxic spores began seeping through tiny cracks in the walls, forcing everyone to don full protective gear. Paul looked at Horace, saw the perseverance in her eyes, and made his decision. "We're doing it," he announced, silencing the arguments. "Every second we waste puts us all at greater risk. Horace, are you absolutely sure?" She nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I trust you, Paul." Working quickly, Paul modified the stasis pod, turning it into a high-powered growth chamber. As he made the final adjustments, he felt the weight of every life in the facility, human and Lurian, resting on his shoulders. Horace climbed into the chamber, her movements careful but determined. As the lid closed, she locked eyes with Paul. No words were needed. Everything they felt passed between them in that single, charged moment. Paul activated the chamber, and immediately Horace's body convulsed with pain. He forced himself to watch the monitors, making constant adjustments to keep her stable as the embryo grew at an unprecedented rate. Around them, the situation grew ever more dire. Captain Harris reported multiple breaches in their defensive line, with several Earth soldiers showing signs of blight infection. Vex and Elder Czar worked tirelessly to reinforce the inner sanctum, but their efforts were visibly failing. Alarms blared as the blight penetrated the final layer of defenses. Paul's heart raced, but he forced his hands to remain steady as he worked. The embryo was approaching full term, its growth far outpacing anything he had anticipated. In a burst of motion, the chamber's lid flew open. Paul reached in, his hands shaking as he lifted out a fully formed infant, a perfect blend of human and Lurian features. The child's eyes opened, revealing an awareness that sent a shiver down Paul's spine. As if sensing the urgency of the situation, the infant's body began producing massive quantities of the blight-curing enzyme. Paul and Dr. Sato worked feverishly to harvest and synthesize the compound, aware that every second counted. With the cure finally ready, Paul first administered it to Horace, whose vitals had weakened dangerously during the accelerated gestation. Color returned to her skin as the enzyme took effect, and her eyes fluttered open. "Paul," she whispered, her gaze moving to the infant in his arms. "Our child." There was no time for a prolonged reunion. Paul handed the baby to Horace and rushed to help Dr. Sato disperse the cure through the outpost air filtration system. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The encroaching blight began to recede, withering away as it came into contact with the airborne enzyme. A cheer went up from the surviving humans and Lurians as they watched their salvation spread through the facility. As the immediate danger passed, Paul returned to Horace and their newborn child. The infant displayed remarkable cognitive abilities, forming an instant bond with both parents. Around them, the surviving team members gathered, awe-struck by the miracle they had just witnessed. Captain Harris's voice came over the comms, filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Dr. Holmes, the blight is retreating. Whatever you did in there, it worked. I'm contacting Earth now to report on the situation." Paul nodded, though he knew the captain couldn't see him. His mind was already racing ahead to the challenges they would face. The hybrid child was the key to producing the cure on a large scale, a fact that would have enormous implications for both Earth and the Lurian homeworld. As he held his child with Horace leaning against him, Paul knew that their greatest trials were still ahead. The world outside the outpost had changed irrevocably, and they would be at the center of a new era in human-Lurian relations. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, Paul allowed himself to simply be present with his unconventional family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. For now, they had earned this brief respite. The child cooed softly, its eyes darting between its parents with uncanny intelligence. Paul and Horace exchanged a look of wonder and trepidation. Their journey was not nearly finished, but they had taken the first crucial steps towards a future neither of them could have imagined. As the immediate crisis subsided, Paul turned his attention to the world beyond the outpost. With Horace cradling their newborn child, he activated the external sensors and gasped at the sight that greeted him. The once blighted landscape was transforming before their eyes. Patches of vibrant Lurian flora burst through the decaying remnants of the blight, reclaiming the land with startling speed. The cure, carried on the wind, was spreading far beyond the outpost walls. "It's working," Paul breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's actually working." Horace joined him at the view screen, her eyes wide with wonder. "Our child," she said, looking down at the infant in her arms. "This is all because of them." The next few months passed in a whirlwind of activity. Paul and Horace, along with their team of human and Lurian scientists, worked tirelessly to establish a sustainable method of enzyme production. They discovered that their child's rapidly maturing cells could be safely cultivated in specialized bioreactors, allowing for large-scale manufacturing of the cure without putting undue stress on the infant. As news of their breakthrough spread, the outpost became a beacon of hope. Refugees from blight-affected Lurian colonies began to return, eager to reclaim their homeland. Paul and Horace found themselves at the center of a rapidly expanding operation, coordinating relief efforts and overseeing the distribution of the cure. One morning, as Paul was reviewing data on the latest batch of enzyme production, Horace approached him with a determined look in her eyes. "We need to go out there," she said, gesturing towards the world beyond their sanctuary. "Our people need us." Paul nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You're right. It's time we saw firsthand what our work has accomplished." They prepared for their journey, outfitting a small transport with the necessary equipment to continue their research on the move. As they loaded the last of their supplies, Dr. Sato approached them. "I've been in contact with the United Nations Interstellar Affairs Committee," she said. "They're cautiously optimistic about our progress, but they want results, tangible proof of what we've achieved here." Paul smiled wryly. "Well, we're about to give them exactly that." As they set out on their journey, Paul couldn't help but marvel at the transformation taking place around them. The Blight's retreat had left behind a canvas for new life, and nature was quick to reclaim it. Lurian plants in every shade of blue and purple carpeted the ground, their leaves shimmering with an iridescent quality that took Paul's breath away. Their first stop was a small Lurian settlement on the outskirts of the once blighted zone. As they approached, Paul saw a crowd gathering, their thorn-like appendages quivering with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Horace stepped out first, their child held close to her chest. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a ripple of astonished murmurs. Paul joined them, standing tall beside his unconventional family. An elderly Lurian, his bark weathered and cracked, stepped forward. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Have you brought us salvation?" Paul nodded, gesturing to the thriving vegetation around them. "The cure is already at work here," he said. "But we've brought more, enough to ensure your community's full recovery." As they distributed the cure and instructed the settlers on its use, Paul watched the transformation in their eyes. Hope, long extinguished, flickered back to life. It was a scene that would repeat itself many times over the coming months as they traveled from settlement to settlement. However, their journey was not without its challenges. In one remote outpost, they encountered a group of Lurian extremists who viewed the human-Lurian collaboration as an abomination. Paul and Horace found themselves cornered, facing a hostile crowd armed with primitive but deadly weapons. "You've corrupted our species," one of the extremists snarled, pointing a thorny appendage at their child. "That thing is an affront to nature." Paul stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "This child is the reason your world is healing," he said calmly. "Look around you. The blight is gone. Your people are thriving again. Is that not worth setting aside your prejudices?" For a tense moment, Paul thought his words had fallen on deaf ears. But then, a younger Lurian pushed through the crowd. "He speaks the truth," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "I've seen the effects of their cure with my own eyes. We owe them our lives." Slowly, the tension dissipated. The extremists, while not entirely convinced, allowed them to continue their work. As they left the outpost, Horace squeezed Paul's hand. "That was too close," she said softly. Paul nodded, his mind focused. "But it won't stop us. We have too much work left to do." As they continued their journey, their child, whom they had named Zara, grew at an astonishing rate. Within months, she was walking and talking, her intellect far surpassing that of either human or Lurian children her age. Paul and Horace found themselves facing the unique challenge of raising a hybrid child, blending their different parenting techniques and cultural norms. One evening, as they made camp in a newly rejuvenated forest, Zara approached them with a serious expression on her face. "Why are some people afraid of me?" she asked, her eyes, a striking blend of human and Lurian features, filled with confusion. Paul and Horace exchanged a look, realizing they couldn't shield their child from the complexities of their situation any longer. "Some people fear what they don't understand," Horace explained gently. "And you, my dear, are something entirely new. But that doesn't make you any less valuable or loved." Paul nodded in agreement. "You're a bridge between our two species, Zara. That's something to be proud of." As Zara processed this information, her expression shifted from confusion to persistence. "Then I'll help them understand," she said with a certainty that belied her young age. Paul smiled, feeling a swell of pride. Their journey was a long way to go, but with each passing day, he grew more confident in the future they were building. A future where humans and Lurians could coexist and thrive together, with Zara as living proof of what they could accomplish when they worked as one.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.